And of course, we'd be remiss if we didn't at least touch upon the incident that happened in Ottawa yesterday. Frank D'Angelo will be coming on in half an hour. I'm sure he's going to have a lot to say about that. But before Frank joins us, we'll at least talk about that, just to touch upon what was a terrorist activity in Ottawa yesterday in front of the War Memorial near Parliament. An individual, and his name's he's been identified as Michael Abdul Zahaf Bibo, shot a veteran, an innocent veteran holding a rifle which didn't have any ammunition in it. The individual died, and the gunsman, he was subsequently murdered. I don't know if that's actually taken out, maybe let's just put it that way. The individual who was shot was murdered, the gunsman, the rifleman, was murdered. You know what? It's a very, very sad situation. It's a sobering situation, but it's also a shot of reality that this is like the second time in a week that two representatives of our armed forces have been gunned down innocently. One who was gunned down. The other was run over by a car. Run over by a car. These are things that are just hard to grasp. Yet it's a world in which we live in right now, where there's a terrorist threat, and now it's happened right in front of our eyes here in Canada, in front of Parliament, close enough that the Prime Minister, if this crazed gunman would have not been stopped, he potentially could have done something far more dangerous. So, Carlin, again, it's a day after, but I think people are still reeling and trying to come to some sort of a comprehension about what happened.
Yeah, this is kind of breaking new ground for us as Canadians. We kind of have a tendency to view terror attacks as something that only happens elsewhere, and it was a very startling and very sobering day, definitely for all Canadians. And of course, our thoughts go out to the family of Corporal Nathan Cirillo, the Canadian Army reservist who was shot. And also as well, that this could have been a much worse situation was it not for the quick work and quick thinking of the Sergeant of Arms of the Canadian House of Commons, Kevin Vickers, who did shoot the terrorist dead, and deserves all the heroic praise that's being directed his way right now. But it's still a time where we're asking a lot of questions. We don't know exactly why this happened. We don't know who, if anyone, this individual was representing, whether it was related to the attack in Quebec or not. There's still so much that we don't know about this situation. I would urge caution and pause in vilifying any group or any other individual who maybe in the media kind of attached to this scenario. It's very, very sobering. I have family who is very proudly serve in the armed forces, and of course my thoughts went to them immediately when this happened. And it's really, really sobering, really, really mind-numbing this is happening, especially when you heard that the Canadian Armed Forces were being told not to wear the uniforms home yesterday. All bases were closed to the public after this attack. It makes you wonder what the RCMP and what CSIS know that they aren't ready to release to the public yet, whether our armed forces soldiers, our brave men and women, are being targeted individually, whether it's something that's part of a larger scheme. Again, we don't know yet. There's just still so much we don't know. But yesterday, it really gave us a first-hand glimpse of what can happen in this world, and the kind of tragedy that can befall anyone. Our freedoms, our human, our regard for human life and human decency. We're all a little bit shaken, but I hope that we all, again, take pause in this and move forward and do so in a Canadian manner. I was very proud of the coverage of CBC yesterday, very mindful of not overreacting. It was almost the antithesis of something that the Americans would have covered. There was not a bunch of screaming and bold headlines. It was a situation where everyone was just trying to identify what happened, who was involved, and where we go from here. And kudos to Peter Mansbridge for being the voice of reason in that scenario.
Bill, the situation we're a sports network. We touch upon themes that don't necessarily have to do with sports, and yet herein we're particularly mindful of the fact that there was a hockey game that was going to be played last night in Ottawa between the Maple Leafs and the Ottawa Senators, and the game was postponed. But it was a kind of a thing that maybe, as people that spend a lot of our time following sports, we're drawn maybe a little bit closer to this because of the sports element. I'm wondering what your thoughts are about all this.
Well, first of all, it was a very tough day for those of us who couldn't understand why we didn't get unanimous support to eliminate the threat of ISIS. And as Carlin said, let's not connect the second one with ISIS quite yet. But it has all to do with ISIS, as far as I'm concerned, because when they ran over our soldier and killed him, and then monkey see, monkey do, within 48 hours, another one is down. It says to me, as a conspiracy theorist, which I'm not, but most people are, that the boys in ISIS have said, okay, we haven't been able to behead any Canadians, so let's do it another way. Let's try and eliminate some of their soldiers. And I'm not sure that that's what it's all about, but when you're dealing with ISIS, and I'm not, thank God, I don't know what goes through their mindset. If somebody was to say, what do you think happened? I would say, well, they got 2 Americans, they got 2 Brits, and they wanted to get 2 Canadians. So that's the end of that on the short term. Are the Liberals and the New Democrats convinced that we should have been over there or not? And I say that with a little bit of reservation, but not much. I try to say it with a clear mind. And when I see Evan Solomon, one of my favorite guys on CBC, presenting the Liberal side of the argument one more time, now they've linked the murders with the reason for going overseas. I say, Evan, for Christ's sakes, don't show the liberal bias that CBC is so full of. So I had a lot of mixed emotions by the time it was over, but I do credit the CBC, particularly Peter Mansbridge, with maintaining a stiff handle on the wheel and not falling into the liberal trap that most of his broadcasters do.
Carlin just mentioned about when something like this happens in the U.S. and how it's presented. It happens far too frequently in the U.S., and now it's happened twice. An act of terrorism, an act of manslaughter, whether it was done with a car, whether it was done with a rifle. It's happened more often than we care to remember or we'd like to remember in the U.S. Now it's happening in front of us here in Canada. And you're mentioning about how it was presented on TV. I think there's maybe the precedent has been set now in the modern day world in which we live in to see how the media reacts to this, to see how they get the Prime Minister talking. Because that's the first thing that I thought about, was how close this was to where the Prime Minister was in caucus, or where he was talking to some of the members of Parliament, and the work that must have been done by security to hustle him out of there. Like, you see stuff like that in the movies. Well, here it happened, right here in Canada. This thing was so close that had, you're talking about the Sergeant of Arms, the Canadian House of Commons, Kevin Vickers, not actually put his body right in the line of fire. I mean, he was sacrificing himself. He was able to take out the gunman, but who knows what would have happened had the gunman really gotten past that point. Who knows? Yeah,
but who knows, Perry, how he got to that point?
That's
the discussion. How we could allow a guy with a long rifle to walk through under the Peace Bridge, or not bridge, but the Peace Tower, and walk right into the House, not the House of Commons, but into the main rotunda, and or as Evan Solomon calls it, the main rotundra, and walk right down to within. And you talk about distance. I would say that if you say 50 yards from the Prime Minister, you might be exaggerating a little.
Mm-hmm. And the thing was that, again, I was watching the coverage in BC, and they said, we knew about the possibility of something like this happening a few days ahead of time. So, I mean, there were enough people that were sending out warning signs that weren't being heeded, or maybe thought it was, people crying wolf. So it's not like when it happened the first time, when the individual was run down by a car, right away you would have thought something would have been done to sort of let's pay attention to this. So you're asking, how could a guy come in there with a rifle? It's because somehow or another this either wasn't taken seriously, or we thought we were, we were not going to be.
Yeah, we weren't on alert. We were not, and even the Ottawa police admitted that they were caught by surprise. So for those people who were telling us retrospectively that they knew a day in advance that this was going to happen, are they part of ISIS?
Well, we're not talking that this was going to happen, but there was a threat to Canada as we know it right now. A threat to security is what they were saying. If they knew exactly what was going to happen, then obviously the protection would have been there, or the security would have been there. But it was basically saying that we have to.
Us is what they were saying. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, it's just a situation here where, again, we live in Canada. We love Canada. The freedoms that we have that in some other countries don't have. And yet now something's going to happen right now. It's a question of, are we going to radicalize the way that we provide security for certain areas, or are we just going to, learn something from it, and where are we going to go from here?
I'm hoping that we don't go too far in one direction or another. We saw what happened in the hysteria in the States post 9/11. The things like the Patriot Act and all these domestic surveillance programs that are still being challenged today. I hope we don't go in that direction. That seems a very un-Canadian way to handle it. I do think that security in the Parliament building should be tightened because, as Bill said, how does this guy just walk in there with a long gun and that's just that. I really hope that we just give some sober second thought to our reaction in this, and that we don't, rally the war cries too much for what the situation warrants. Although it was tremendous tragedy, and again, my thoughts are with the family of Nathan Cirillo at this time. I don't want to see an overreaction. I don't want my country to become overly paranoid and overly militaristic based on this one or two incidents.